Today we're talking about HDZero, and this is going to be a step-by-step guide in getting yourself up and running with HDZero if you've never used the system before. In this video I'm going to cover the hardware, talk about what you need to get the system ready, talk about the wiring to your flight controller, the configuration in Betaflight, and hopefully just walk you through everything you need to know to get your first experience with HDZero up and running as smoothly as possible. Now, just before I jump into this video, I just want to add, if you do find it useful, please do consider hitting the subscribe button. And if you'd like to support the channel to allow us to keep making content like this, there is a link to my Patreon as well as Buy Me a Coffee. And it is only by you guys supporting us am I able to keep making videos like this and hopefully helping people along the way. Anyway, let's get on with this video and let's take a look at the hardware and what you're actually going to need first of all. Okay, so to start, and the best place for that is actually just to quickly explain what HDZero is. If you don't know, it is a digital FPV system that consists of a goggles module or a set of goggles with a digital receiver built in, such as the Scout HDs. You have a digital VTX, a camera, as well as a couple of little sundry items that make the system up. The real benefits of HDZero is that it offers ultra low latency digital FPV video up to 720p 60 frames a second, but the real thing on this system is that it is fixed latency and it is not variable latency like other systems on the market. To get yourself up and running, you are going to need to get yourself a goggles module or a set of goggles with the HD system built in. At the point of me making this video, that is only the Scout HDs from Fat Shark, but you can use the goggles module with any FPV goggles that have HDMI input, such as the HDO2s, the Skyzone 04Xs, or even the Orca FPV1s. You will then need to get yourself one of the many VTXs that are available, and we'll talk about the differences between a couple of them in a moment. You will need a dedicated camera for the system as well, which features a MIPI connector. Something to note on the cameras is whilst there are cameras that are designed to work with the DJI system, they are not compatible with HDZero. You will need cameras that are specifically designed for the HDZero system, such as from Foxeer, Runcam, or the dedicated HDZero cameras themselves, like I've got here. Once you have all parts of the system, you're ready to get yourself up and running, and the first thing you're going to need to do is connect your VTX to your flight controller. Before we do that though, we will hop over to the overhead and we'll take a look at the differences between a couple of the VTXs first. So in front of me, we have two HDZero VTXs. We have the Race version 2 VTX and the Whoop VTX. Both of these have the same power output of up to 200 milliwatts, but there are some differences in the features and capabilities between them, which we'll talk about in a minute. At the point of me making this video, there are currently 4 VTXs available for the HDZero system. You have the original dual board 500 milliwatt VTX. You have the version 1 Race VTX, which was more rectangular, the new version 2 like I've got here, and the 200 milliwatt Whoop board. There is a new up to 1 watt VTX coming in the very near future, and that again will offer some new features and capabilities that we've not seen before, including that increased power output. As I've mentioned here, both of these boards support up to 200 milliwatts output, but that really is where the similarity ends. The Race version 2 is a higher quality board overall with some extra features and capabilities designed to make it better for general use. For instance, it supports smart audio, allowing you to change the settings via Lua scripts. It has securable inputs and outputs. So for instance, the UFL and the MIPI connector for the camera are securable via a cable tie, whereas on the Whoop board they're not. And it has a better overall power setup, including having a built-in TVS diode to help offer some additional protection. It also has better mounting options, and whereas they are both 20 by 20, this board actually has isolated inputs, allowing you to actually put it on rubber insulators included with it as well, just helping to offer some extra protection when in your frame. Just walking you through some of the main inputs and outputs on these boards. What you have on all HDZero boards is your MIPI connector for your camera. Now this, as I've already mentioned, is a dedicated MIPI connection. It is not the same one used by DJI on either the camera or the cable, and you will need to make sure that you get the right cable and camera for the HDZero system and that they are compatible. We have our antenna connector, which is UFL on both of these boards, but it could be MMCX as on the 500 milliwatt. We have our firmware update connector, and this is where you actually install the cable between the goggles module or goggles and the VTX to allow you to update the firmware. And I do have a separate dedicated video on that, which I will link to in the description of the video. You have your power input up here, as well as your serial port inputs for your MSP, which offers your OSD as well as smart audio capabilities. Just moving around the rest of the board, just to talk about some important other things. You have your HDZero chipsets located here and here with our MIPI camera input IC. We have our power amplifier located here and here, and this is what actually provides that 200 milliwatts of output. And then you have your various voltage regulation stages over the VTX, such as this here and this here on this one. It is worth noting that if you cause any damage on these VTXs, you could have some problems with it working. A common issue on the race version 2 is that people knock off the diodes. There is a TVS diode located on the top of the board here, and on the bottom of the board under here you have a standard voltage protection diode which offers protection against reverse polarity. You will also note on the bottom of both of these boards there is another connector, and that is this one here and this one here. And this is allowing you to actually plug in a little board such as this one here to configure the settings on the VTX. You don't have to have this if you don't intend to configure them on the ground via, say, smart audio or via MSP, but it is handy to have if you do want to do quick configuration, such as changing the channels or setting the VTX power output. Just one other thing to mention on the Race VTX is that it also supports features like pit mode, and that is via the smart audio as well, allowing it to be compliant for race applications. Just before we jump over to setting it up on a flight controller, I just wanted to talk about the camera again. As I've said, you do need to make sure you are using a dedicated HDZero camera as well as the correct compatible cable. These cables are not handed, so you can plug them in any way around, but they are specific to the HDZero system and they are available in many different lengths as well. The camera has this dedicated MIPI connection on the top, and the only thing you really need to be aware of is you do need to be a bit careful with these because they can be easily damaged. When placing the connector onto the camera, you simply place it over in place and give it a gentle push until it's secured. And if your camera does have a back plate, simply screw that on to protect it from coming loose in flight. On the VTX side, you again then simply take your cable and make sure you connect it the right way around, looking at the pads on the connector compared to the pads on the board. So for instance, on the Whoop VTX, it actually goes that way around. So you're simply going to place it on, give it a gentle press, and then it is connected and ready to work. There is some status LEDs located on these boards that will tell you various bits of information about the system, such as power and setting the camera up, and we'll talk about that as we go through it as well. The only other thing to mention on these is with regards to the antenna. You should never power your VTX up without an antenna connected. If you're not going to be using dedicated MMCX antennas, you are going to need a pigtail such as this one here from TBS. And again, because these are UFL connectors, they are quite easy to damage. So you do need to be careful when putting these on. Again, gently, correctly orientating the connection, placing it over the top, placing a little bit of force on, and when it's in place properly, you will be able to rotate it like that, but it should then hold in place. So the next thing we're going to need to do is connect our VTXs to our flight controller. Now, before you do that, I just want to make you aware of a few things with regards to powering it. These VTXs support up to 6S input. However, I strongly advise you always power your digital VTX from HDZero from the back in your flight controller or via a separate back. Whilst you can do it from battery voltage, you get much better protection for your VTX from the back in the flight controller, and if you were to crash, it helps prevent those spikes from your ESC making it through to the VTX and causing damage. As I mentioned earlier, the Race version 2 does have a TVS diode built in, but I also strongly advise you use something like this, which is a Fat Shark spike absorber whenever you're powering your VTX, just to give yourselves some extra protection alongside up to 1,000 microfarads capacitor. These VTXs are a lot more sensitive than the old analog ones that we all used to use, and you want to put as much protection in place as you possibly can. If you are powering it from the back, there isn't a massive need to use a spike absorber, but if you are going to power it from battery voltage directly, do make sure you're using a capacitor, and I strongly recommend you use a spike absorber too, even if you're using the version 2 Race VTX. On your flight controller, you're going to need some available ports. So on this VTX, we only have our MSP connections for the data in and out for the OSD, whereas if you're going to use the Race VTX, you're also going to need a connector for the smart audio as well. What I'm going to do next is get these two wired up, and then I'll jump back and walk you through what we need to do next with regards to setting it up. Okay, so we've now got our VTX connected to our flight controller. We have our power cables going to the 9-volt output on this flight controller. It has that back built in, so I'm going to use it as I mentioned earlier. We have our TX going to RX on UART1 and TX on the flight controller going to RX on the VTX, and then we've got our smart audio, which is an RX going to a TX on the spare UART on the board. Now, they do show this in the instructions for HDZero as well, so the wiring setup is fairly straightforward, and that is the basics ready to go. Next, we're just going to get our camera connected, our antenna connected, because you never power this up without an antenna. We're going to get it all powered up, and then we'll take a look at the actual configuration in Betaflight. So you're probably now at the stage where you're ready to power everything up. We have our VTX with our antenna connected and our camera. Again, never power this up without an antenna connected and ready to go. We have our flight controller with it wired in place, and we have our ESC here for bench testing. Before you fire anything up, I would strongly advise you use one of these. This is a short saver or a smoke stopper. This will prevent any of this burning out should I have accidentally wired something incorrectly. Whilst I've double checked everything, these are strongly advised, and don't be like me and accidentally burn stuff out like I've done in the past. Get yourself one of these and it will offer you some protection. So what we're going to do is hit the button to power it up. You can see we've got power in the flight controller because the LEDs are flashing, and we also have power on our VTX over here as well. Now, these get very hot in use, so if you are powering it up on the bench, I would only recommend doing it for a short period of time without airflow. What I actually have is a bench fan that I use for keeping these things cool when setting these things up and testing them. But what I'm going to do now is just double check everything looks correct, that all looks fine. So I'm going to power it down, get the goggles and everything set up so I can check that it's working first before we then move on to the next steps, which is the configuration in Betaflight. Okay, so I've got it all powered up and it is working. We have our VTX turned on, and I've got a fan here just blowing some cool air over the top just to stop the VTX overheating on the bench. Obviously, we have our flight controller powered up via my short saver and battery located over here. And if I hit over to there, I've got my VRX connected to the HDMI input, and you can see the HDZero actual video footage coming through. The VRX is located just by there, and you can see that we're getting the wireless video working absolutely fine. So the next thing we need to do now is do the configuration for this, because we now need to configure it so we can not only control the VTX via smart audio, but also make sure that we got the MSP data working so we can get that OSD, because again, if I come on the top at the moment, there's no OSD data, so we need to get that up and running next. The configuration instructions for doing this for Betaflight are all listed in the manual for this VTX, which is available for downloading on the HDZero website. If you go there, you can see that they have the manual for the HDZero VTX, which is the one I've got here, the Shark Byte manual, which is for the original 500 milliwatt VTX, and the Whoop board, and there will be more manuals coming on this as they change them over time. However, in the manual for the race VTX, it shows us all of the configuration options, first of all for the OSD, and then further down in here they have the configuration for setting up the smart audio, as well as what you need to paste into the CLI in Betaflight to make sure that it's got the configuration for smart audio working properly as well. At the moment, at the point of me making this video, OSD support is only available in Betaflight. However, it should be coming to iNav very, very soon, and I will cover that in a separate video at the time once that releases. So to do the configuration on this board, we're going to need to first of all configure our serial ports. My VTX is connected via serial 2 for the MSP and serial 3 for smart audio. So the first thing we're going to need to do is enable MSP on serial 2 and make sure the baud rate is set to 115200 as it is here. We're then, for serial 3, going to need to configure our smart audio support. So to do that, we go all the way over to the end and we go down here and we go down to VTX TBS smart audio, because that's the protocol it's using. And then once they're both done, we're going to click save and reboot, and that will save those settings to the flight controller. Once it's rebooted, you can then come back in, check it again, and you can see that serial 2 has our MSP, and then serial 3, UART3, has our TBS smart audio enabled. The next thing we then need to do is go into configuration and just make sure that we have our OSD option turned on down here, as well as telemetry. I always like to make sure that one is turned on as well. Next, we need to enable MSP DisplayPort, or what is known as canvas mode. Now, at the point of me making this video, that is done via a CLI command. That is listed in the HDZero manual for this VTX, and they've got it here so you can nicely copy and paste it into the CLI and turn it on. It is, though, worth noting you do need to set the correct port number when you are configuring this. For instance, it says set OSD DisplayPort device to MSP and set DisplayPort MSP serial to number 4. You will need to configure that for your specific UART, but note there is a difference in the numbering. So for instance, down here it says please note set DisplayPort MSP serial 4 specifies UART 5. So for me, I'm actually going to set that to serial 1, which should set it to the UART2. If you're using UART2, you would set that to 3 and so forth to make sure that you've got the configuration correct. So what I'm going to do is copy that bit of text there a moment. We're going to go back into Betaflight, into the CLI. I'm going to paste this down here, but actually expand it out so I can change the text before doing it. And again, I'm going to change that to number 1, hit enter, type save, hit enter, and that should have now enabled the configuration for MSP DisplayPort, or what is known as canvas mode, on our flight controller. Next, what we'll do is fire it back up and see if all of that is working as expected. Now, as you can see, things don't look quite right and we still don't have OSD, and you might be wondering why. Well, that is because I haven't actually updated the firmware yet on this VTX model, and whilst I've enabled the settings in the flight controller, the chances are this VTX has come with older firmware. So what I'm going to do next is get the firmware update done. Now, as I mentioned, I do have a separate dedicated video on how to do this, but the basics is you connect the VRX module to the VTX via the little included cable, put the firmware file on the SD card and power it up, which I'm going to do now, and then let that firmware update proceed. So the update's done. What we're going to do now is power the VTX up. We'll hop over to the VRX and see what that does. And now we should have our camera. There we go, looking correct. And we also have our OSD information from the flight controller as well. So if you are having problems, make sure that your firmware on your VTX is properly updated, because if it isn't, not only would your camera possibly not work correctly, but you won't get the OSD and stuff too. As I mentioned earlier, I strongly suggest you do the firmware update at the very start and not leaving it to the point I did it, but I did this on purpose to show you the kind of issues you can get. Okay, so the last thing to do is to set up the smart audio support. Now you can see this is listed in the manual up here, and this is only on the VTXs with the smart audio included. You can see it allows you to do things like set the VRX output to 0.1 milliwatt, or you can set it to pit mode, off, and you have all of the features around that as well. It's all explained in here what the options are, and you then have the CLI dump that allows you to do the configuration for it as well, which is listed down here. This may change in the future, because I do know they are working on this, and there's going to be some changes around that potentially in the future as well. But right now you would simply take this CLI information here, and just like we did in the other bit where we pasted it in for enabling MSP DisplayPort, or what is known as canvas mode, you simply paste it in, save, and then that will do the configuration on Betaflight side for getting the smart audio up and running. Okay, so that is the system set up and working. What I'm going to do now is just quickly walk you through some troubleshooting steps if you are having problems on what to check. Starting first of all with image, and if you're not getting video. Well, the first side to start on that is the receiver side and the module. If you've got it connected to your goggles, can you see the menu system coming up on the screen of your goggles? If you can, you know the module is connected properly to the goggles, and the problem then is on your VTX side of things. This side, what you need to be checking is things like power, camera connection, and firmware. So if you're not getting video and you are getting your VRX connected properly, the first thing to do is make sure that your camera is connected properly via the MIPI cable to the VTX, and then make sure that the firmware is updated on the VTX as well. The latest HDZero cameras need the latest firmware, and you may not get it working properly if you don't. You noticed on mine earlier the colors weren't correct, so do make sure that the firmware on the VTX has been updated. If you're still not getting video at that point, make sure that your VTX is getting correct power. If it is being powered from the back on your flight controller, double check that is working. If you have a multimeter, test it with that to check the voltages are correct. If you don't, what I would suggest is power it from the main battery connector directly. That way you're going to put voltage in and make sure that the VTX is getting powered and that it isn't overpowering the back on your flight controller. Another hint is to look at the little red power LED and check that that's bright red and not flickering dim, because that could be a hint that it isn't getting enough power. Those things should get video working because it doesn't require a flight controller connection for video. It simply requires power and camera, and as long as they're all connected, it should connect to your VRX without a problem. Something just to note on that is if you do connect it and things don't look right, just make sure on the VRX side of things that you have the HDMI settings correctly. There is a 720p and a 1080p setting, and on certain goggles like the Sky Zones, you do need to make sure that it is on the 1080p setting, otherwise the colors might not look correct as well. With regards to having issues with the OSD, what you first of all need to do again is make sure that your firmware is updated, as I showed on mine. If it isn't, you may not get it working, and then check the wiring for your UART. Have you configured the correct UART in Betaflight? So remember, if you're using serial 2, that should be UART 2. Is your TX and RX wires the right way around? So for instance, TX on the VTX should go to RX on the flight controller, and RX on the flight controller to TX on the VTX, and it's the same for the RX on the VTX goes to TX on the flight controller. Double check the wiring for that. Are you using a soft serial port? If you are, make sure you're using a proper serial, and then make sure that you have that OSD option turned on and that you have configured MSP DisplayPort correctly in Betaflight via that little CLI command. Again, noting that the number needs to be 1 out, because if it says number 4, that is actually for port 5. If you're using port 3, you need to say port 2. If you're using port 2, you need to say port 1. And when you've done those things, you should get OSD working. If you've double checked everything and you're still not getting OSD, what I would then suggest is trying a different serial port, because you can find that some serial ports on the flight controllers don't always work as expected with some VTXs, and all of the people who I do know who have had problems have had it as a result of not doing the configuration on that one serial port correctly, or that port isn't behaving as we would expect, and choosing a different port resolves the issues. With regards to the smart audio setup specifically on this, again, it's making sure that the serial port is configured correctly. Remember, it needs to go to the TX pin on the serial port on your flight controller, and again, make sure that is configured as per the manual for smart audio on your system. Those are the main things to check, and if you do continue to have problems, HDZero have a fantastic Discord and Facebook group, and I'll put a link to them in the description, but following those things should get you up and running. Now, that is it from me on this one. I hope you have found the video useful. If you have, please do consider hitting the subscribe button, and don't forget to hit the little bell next to it as well. If you'd like to support the channel, please do consider checking out my Patreon, as well as the links to buy me a coffee. It is only by you guys using them am I able to keep making videos like this.